So this is week 3 of our series. And I want to just take a little bit of stock as to where we're going and where we've come from. Next week, we're here on Sunday morning. Perhaps if you've been with us for the last couple of years, you'll notice that the last 2 years, our Christmas Eve services have replaced our normal Sunday service. But Christmas has moved its way a little further down the week. So this year, and this year only, you could come to church on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. You have that choice. Unless you're staff, you have to be here for all 3. But we'll be here for 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock next Sunday morning. The Sunday after, in between Christmas and New Year, we'll also be here at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. Kristen, our generational leader, will actually be speaking on that Sunday morning. So it's going to be fantastic. You're going to really enjoy that. And then Epiphany Sunday, which is the final week of this series. My father's actually flying in from the UK to spend kind of New Year with us. And I said to him, hey, Dad, you've had enough holidays in your life. Why don't you teach with me on Sunday morning? And he agreed. So on Epiphany Sunday, I'll be here with my dad. Now, to be clear, he knows what he's doing when it comes to preaching, so I've not just dragged my dad up and just sort of said, come on, you got to have something to say. So my dad and I will be here on Epiphany. So that's kind of where we're going. Where have we come from? Week 1 of this series, I kind of leaned into the text about this God being with us. And we thought about how if Christmas is the time where we think about God becoming material, that might change how we think about Christmas a little bit, because we often tend to look for a more spiritual Christmas, when actually Christmas is teaching us about how to be here and present to what it is that's going on. In fact, in that series, in that sort of opening part of the series, I suggested that one of the reasons that we give gifts is because the giving of gift reminds us not just of the fact that God was a gift to us, but actually in giving something physical and material, we're somehow leaning into Christmas. So I did at that point say, you need to give a lot of gifts at Christmas and really blow it out, because that's how we live out Jesus. Some of you got in touch with me and said you didn't agree with me on that, and that you felt that actually that was wrong, and we should give less gifts at Christmas. And I just wanted to respond to that by saying, this is Westside, and we're always welcome to everyone, even when you're wrong. Last week, we talked about the unusual start to Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel was kind of unusual. It starts with a guy who's not quite sure he believes God. God comes and offers him this incredible promise of what it is that God's going to do through his family, and he kind of struggles to believe it. And we sort of said, that's a strange way to start the story of Jesus, with a guy who's not sure that he believes. Which then brings us to this week. If you thought Luke's gospel was a strange way to start the story of Jesus, then you're going to love Matthew. This is how Matthew starts his gospel. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. He begins with Abraham because Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Abraham. You did campfire songs too, huh? I am one of them. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. This is kind of going on like this. In fact, it goes on like this for a whole extra page, until it gets to Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. This is how you start a good story. Well, it kind of was in Jesus' time. If you were in Jesus' time and you read a story like this would be like, I'm trying to think of a story that you might, and let's say you're a James Bond fan because you like your films to be chauvinist, and And so what they do in James Bond films is they kind of roll out a kind of little action sequence at the start of the movie where Bond does something. And what it does is it kind of sets up the character for you. Look at this character. He's going to be amazing. And this is going to be a great film. And you're there with your popcorn and you turn to your buddy and you go like, yeah, this is going to be a great film. In Jesus' time, like if you read a list like this, like you're like, this is going to be a good story because this is like a who's who of famous people in Israel. Like this is going to be an awesome story because genealogies, what they did was they kind of set up who you were. If you came from an amazing family, if your family line was full of the heroes of the country, then you were also going to be a pretty impressive person. So an introduction like this is kind of like the Instagram wall of today, where you just kind of scroll through this person's social media feed and you're like, look at all the amazing stuff that this person does. They must be awesome. I should follow them. Matthew's genealogy, it has 40 men in it. Now, if you're reading this as a Jewish person in the first century, anytime you get in certain numbers mean a lot of things. So 40 is a number that kind of leans into notions of perfection. There's 40 men here, like, wow, that's really interesting. These 40 men are grouped into 3 groups. 3 is another number that sort of symbolizes harmony and perfection. And of these 3 groups, they're in 14 generations, and 14 as a kind of multiple of 7 is another one of those numbers. So you've got 40 and 3 and 14 is like, this is just like headline Jewish story. Matthew's trying to tell you something. This is the Messiah's story, and his story looks perfect. And it's going to be an exciting one. So the story continues in the next verse. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. So Joseph is here, and we're about to hear his part of the story. And within one verse, we discover that Joseph's girl that he's engaged to is pregnant. So Matthew takes this incredible setup. It appears he takes this incredible history, all of this great genealogy, and kind of drives it into the wall. Like he set the story up awesomely. It'd be like watching your James Bond movie, and after that amazing start, he gets shot in the head and is dead. You're like, whoa. And all of us that were born in the last 40 years, oh, thank goodness, finally. That's not what you would expect. You don't take a genealogy like this and read it into a story. In those days, if you found out that your girlfriend was pregnant to somebody else, you'd be kind of unhappy about that. And probably be unhappy about that these days as well, right? This is not the story we want. This story has a little bit of kind of discomfort to it. So her husband, Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. After he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son. You are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save people from their sins. The name Jesus literally means the Lord saves. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. A man with Joseph's background, with his story, with his ancestry, doesn't need a scandal like this. Because Joseph, the text tells us, is a righteous man. And a righteous man means he's someone in good standing. His appearance, his perspective, the way he's understood in his society is a good one. And so Joseph, in a culture, particularly like that culture, doesn't need a pregnant fiancée, and especially not when he's not the father. This is not a good situation because he's righteous. And what do we mean by righteous when we say it means to be in good standing? And often what we do is we assume theological things. So we start to think about good standing with God. How is this person in their relationship with God? Righteous is a kind of word that we invariably just use in and within church world. But if it just means good standing, maybe it's broader than that. And what we find actually is the word righteousness often refers to just how we're perceived and how we present ourselves. How do we look like we're standing in the world? So it's easy to think about how you stand with God, but what about how you stand with your peers? Because that seems to be Joseph's problem in this particular text. I want to suggest that all of us struggle with righteousness. And actually, I want to suggest that we all struggle with righteousness every single day. It's just that we don't call it righteousness. We use different language to describe a series of questions that many of us ask on a regular basis. Have you ever felt yourself phrase in your mind, or maybe you've even said it out loud, am I good enough? Am I anything enough? The moment you get into the questions about your own enoughness, you're actually having a conversation about righteousness with yourself. Am I good enough? Or perhaps a different question, a way more common question that we seem to learn in our infancy. What will people think? And Joseph seems to be governed by this sort of question. Like this situation he finds himself in, the question is, what will people think? And because we often think that, what we do as humans is we invariably curate an image of ourselves that we present in public that suits what we think people expect of us. The way we dress, the way we handle ourselves, the way we talk, all of these things are about how we manage the impressions that people have of us. It's literally called impression management. Social scientists that study this talk about politeness theory as to why we do the things that we do so that when we meet people and talk to people, they kind of get the impression from us that we want them to have. We essentially, what we're doing almost all the time in our lives is presenting an image of ourselves that we hope people will believe is real. The emphasis, of course, being on will people believe it? Carrie Batten, in a recent article in The New Yorker, says if every action has an equal and opposite reaction, then every perfectly staged Instagram photo must have a mess lurking just out of frame. Parents relate to this. That beautiful picture that you put on the Christmas card that you sent to everyone, and to which family members write back and say, what a beautiful family. Because they didn't see the swearing and cursing that happened to make the child sit just still long enough, please, for all that's good and holy, so that we can take this picture and send it to the grandparents. And we see the picture, but we know the story. And we live behind these stories. It's fascinating, actually, because I think social media, it's easy to pick on, but I do think it's one of the most fascinating places to study righteousness today. Because what we find is a whole media that's given to presenting the image of ourselves that we want people to see. We've probably all staged those moments. These little candid moments where it's just you and look at how great this looks. But if somebody picks up your phone, there's like 14 pictures of you just trying to get the right amount of towel, feet, sand, and horizon so that everybody back home feels jealous. You can actually get apps for your phone that will get rid of all these doubles because they so know that none of our candid pictures are actually candid. They're curated. And we all also know how stressful and anxious it can be trying to create the perfect moment for everybody else to see. And I think some of the reason that we find this tension is because actually righteousness and our search for being how people want us to be and social media, they both kind of collide into two competing human problems. On one hand, we really do want to be honest. Like it's in us. There's something in us that would like to be honest. We'd like to be authentic and truthful. But then the other side, we're also aspirational. We'd like to be better than we actually are. And it seems to me that social media is a fascinating study in what happens when those two things collide. How do I present a symbol of my own honesty and authenticity while also constantly living thinking I wish things were a little better than they actually are? And you see this, if you follow any social media at all, you'll notice how the kind of aspirational and the honesty sort of collide, that now we've hit this period after Instagram turns 10 years old next year. And after a lot of years of what we all know to be fake pictures, we're now getting real pictures. You know what I mean? The kind of that celebrity that you follow that's there, their hair's perfect, their nails are perfect, but now they're vacuuming. Because I too can relate to you common people. They're vacuuming up money, but but we can relate. And we see all of these kind of carefully crafted and curated moments of apparent honesty. But let's be honest, like, we all know that they're not real. Like the kind of real that we see on Instagram, and even we ourselves sometimes do it. Let me just give you an honesty post for a moment. I'm going to tell you what my life's really like. But we never tell people what our life is really like. Like, we don't post the pictures of, hey, this is the third time I'm giving my kids Kraft dinner this week. Like we never post that. We post the kind of avocado toast and like, look what my kids eat once a month. And we post that. We don't, we share, like I'm bad at this. We'll share these kind of pictures and these articles of like, look at what happens if your kids spend too much time on the internet, and look at what happens if their screen time is out of control. But we don't share Saturday morning where you literally half asleep just hand iPads to small people and say, please just go away and let me have 10 minutes more sleep. I don't care what it's doing to your brain. Or future relationships. We don't share that. We don't share the breakups and the arguments. We don't share the performance anxiety. We don't share the imposter syndrome. We don't share our debts. It's all curated, even when we're trying to be honest, because we're trying to present a particular image. And of course, what's fascinating is actually, I don't think we're being liars when we're doing this. We're not intentionally being inauthentic, because actually, when you really dig into our quest for righteousness, the one person that we're trying to convince more than any is ourselves. We have an image of ourselves that when we present ourselves on Instagram or Facebook, what we're really saying is, this is who I'd like to be. This is what I want to be. I'm not trying to lie. It's just I wish my life was more like this. We have a moral self-image. We have a presentation of ourselves that we want to be true. We're not being intentionally fake. In a recent article in The Guardian, Oliver Berkman spoke about how they did a survey just recently of various cities, 355 cities of the world. And what they did was they went to these 355 cities and they dropped across them all, they dropped 17,000 wallets. And in the wallets, they had a piece of ID that would instruct somebody as to who they could call in the event of finding this wallet. And the wallets were spread. Some of the wallets had nothing in them. Some of the wallets had $20 in them. And some of the wallets had what was roughly $100 in them. And they dropped these across all of these cities. And the question was, how many will we get back? What was fascinating was the empty wallets that simply had ID in them, 40% of them came back. So 40% of people in this 17,000 wallet study gave back an empty wallet, called up and said, hey, I found your wallet. Interestingly, if the wallet had $20 or a currency close to that in it, 51% of the wallets came back. So there was an 11% difference between an empty wallet and a wallet with $20 in it. Of the wallets that had $100 in it, 72% of them were returned. Wow, we say, we really are good. Our faith in humanity is not misguided. Maybe actually people are good. But then the researchers went back to the people and said, why did you bring the wallet back? What was it that motivated to you? And what they discovered was the reason that people brought the wallets back wasn't related to their desire to be good or not, but actually it was to do with their moral self-image. The greater the amount of money in the wallet that a person found created a higher competition in the person's kind of internal morality about whether or not they saw themselves as a thief. And we have an aversion to seeing ourselves as a thief. And the higher the amount of the money, the greater the likelihood we have to deal with that. It wasn't about nobody else knew. It wasn't about what other people would think. It was about what people thought about themselves. We want to be good. But the question for us often is to think about is it that we want to be good, or are we just satisfied with seeing ourselves as good? Or are we just satisfied with other people seeing us as good? The Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard argued that to be authentic required a person to have an absolute relationship to the absolute. You see, Joseph had a law, and he needed to follow it. The Jewish law was very strict on what to do in situations like Joseph found himself in. We have Instagram or a neighbor or a peer, somebody out there that's watching us that we care about what they think, and we know that we can't break away from that and we can't just ignore that. So the reality for many of us, in fact, perhaps the reality for all of us, is that we never really find ourselves in a place of true authenticity where we can have an absolute relationship with the absolute, because we're always managing perceptions of ourselves. And so often that matters to us more than other things. It's not new. Isaiah in chapter 64 of his prophetic book, in verse 6, he says this: all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous acts are like filthy rags. The failed attempt to appear like we've got it all together. Perhaps if Isaiah was writing today, he'd say something like, your lawn looks amazing, but your house is a mess. But as long as my lawn looks amazing and my front door is shiny, everybody will assume that everything inside is the same. Your Instagram has you smiling, but you're emailing your therapist from the bathroom. Let's circle back to Joe for a second, because something's not quite right in this story. If you pay attention to the story, there's a couple of hints that it's not quite going the way it's supposed to. He clearly wants to appear righteous, right? He's a righteous man, and this situation is just not the situation that he signed up for, and he's uncomfortable with it. And he wants to break things off with Mary. You can interpret that from the text. It's not difficult to see. But the interesting thing is he doesn't actually do what's right. According to Deuteronomy, which is the law that people in Joseph's time in Israel should have followed, Deuteronomy is really clear on what you're supposed to do with this. In chapter 22 and verse 23, it says, if a situation like this happens, the lady should be taken outside and stoned to death. Super Christmassy story. Jingle bells, But that's what the law demands. The law says this is what's supposed to happen. But here we see Joseph, he's not doing that. He's a righteous man, and he wants to do right, or he wants to appear like he's doing right, but he doesn't really want Mary to get stoned to death. Maybe he's got a little bit of goodness about him. He's like, this seems a little rough. I don't want to sort of play it out like this. We don't get a real insight into why he decides not to play the whole law out. So we kind of read this and go, okay, what's actually going on here? The law demands that he should do this, and he wants to be righteous, and he wants to have a good public image, but he doesn't want Mary to be stoned to death. It's interesting how your law, whatever it is that you live by, whether it's the law in Joseph's time, whether it's Instagram, or whether it's just your impression management that you're negotiating in your life, it will always require more of you than you're willing to give. There'll always be a glossier person on the social media feed. There'll always be somebody with a better lawn and better kids and a better vacation to go to. And invariably, it'll eventually get to a point where you decide, I'm not willing to go as far as this seems to want to demand that I do go. For Joseph, it seems like, I don't really want Mary to be stoned to death. And your journey might be different, but there'll always be a line where you go, I can't go any further. Maybe it's exhaustion, or maybe it's right and wrong, or who knows what it is. But here, Joseph, he tries to kind of manipulate a situation. I need to get out of this. I need to maintain my own reputation, but I'm not quite willing to do what the law says I'm supposed to do. Which raises a question: is Joseph a righteous man? Or is he, by not doing what the law says, being an unrighteous man? Or is this story from Matthew doing something else entirely? Of course, you're probably suspicious that this story is doing something else entirely. And of course it is. And in fact, the story's been hinting at it the whole time. While we were kind of trawling our way through those list of names, and you were like kind of just sort of thinking like, what on earth is this we've signed up for this morning? And you were reading through all these names. Matthew was actually dropping some huge hints to you that this story's not going the way that it's supposed to be going. Many of us miss the hints because basically, the background in Jewish ancestry around Bible times is not what we watch, when American Idol's on. So, maybe. Matthew's genealogy of the Messiah contains 4 women in it. That's quite unusual because generally in his time, genealogies are always just male. But Matthew snuck in the names of 4 women. Perhaps you saw them as we read through the first part of the text. There was Tamar, there was Rahab, there was Ruth, and then there was Uriah's former wife, whose name is Bathsheba. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. The fascinating thing is these 4 women are actually slightly problematic in this story. Not only in Matthew's time do you not put women in the genealogy, that wouldn't be just the normal way to do it back then. The women he picks are kind of slightly problematic when you're trying to set out a story of heroes. Tamar, she was the mother of Perez and Zerah. So you assume, so her husband was Judah. Well, actually, no. If you read the story, what it turns out is that Tamar is actually the widowed daughter-in-law of Judah. And Judah was supposed to look after Tamar when his son died and she didn't have a husband, but he failed in his responsibility to look after her, leaving her in a predicament that was quite bad. So distant was Judah from Tamar that one day he saw her and didn't recognize her, thought she was a prostitute, slept with her, and she got pregnant with twins. Really catching the Christmas vibe this morning. I know that you're like, yes, this is what I signed up for. So this is like a scandal story that Judah, the great hero of Israel, like this is just ugly and horrible. This poor girl finds herself in this horrendous situation, but here she is in this story here. Oh, what about Boaz? Boaz's mom was Rahab. Maybe you remember Rahab from Sunday school or something like that. Rahab was a sex worker in Jericho. And when the Israelites moved in to try and take control of that particular area, it was Rahab that let the Israelites into Jericho so they could spy this land out and actually sort of move there and unfold God's promises from them. But Rahab is a foreigner. She's not purebred Israel. And yet she's been kind of brought into this story with a career path that the Bible doesn't seem to kind of really want to promote. And she's not from Israel. And of course, Boaz becomes the father of Obed. And Obed's mom was Ruth. And Ruth was a Moabite girl who found herself in Israel through a really sad story of her again being widowed and came to Israel and met Boaz and becomes sort of in this family line of King David. Ruth was an immigrant. And in Israel, they had this view about where they kind of wanted to keep their own pure blood line of how things were going in those particular times. But here, the great grandmother of King David is an immigrant. And then we get to David himself. And David is the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Uriah's wife was a girl named Bathsheba, and David saw her one day, and essentially, the only way you can read it as a modern person is it's a rape situation of which David tries to cover up, and in covering it up, he has Uriah killed. And Bathsheba becomes pregnant, the mother of Solomon. Like this is less like a genealogy of impressive heroes, and it starts to feel more like a gossip column. It feels like something you'd read in National Enquirer, not the Bible. And yet Matthew starts his gospel there, and it doesn't cover it up. You'd have been happy with King David. Oh, I like him. There's that whole David and Goliath story. Like, I'm comfortable with that. But Matthew goes, no, I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to tell you about the worst moment of his failing. I'm going to put that in Jesus' genealogy. It seems like there's a big difference for Matthew between what is right and doing what is right. There's a difference between what everybody thinks is correct and what everybody thinks you should do and what Matthew wants to tell us might be righteousness. Matthew is introducing us to a different way of telling a story because the way he's telling us the story involves a different understanding of righteousness, a different understanding of how people are presenting themselves. The angel comes to Joseph and he says, this story might look bad, but this is what you're going to do. You're not going to engage in impression management and just kind of swiftly move Mary out the back door. You're not going to live by the law as it says you should and have Mary stoned to death. Actually, you're going to do what is actually right, what is actually just. See, because in the Bible, true righteousness, which is also true justice, the biblical word for righteousness and justice are the same thing. True righteousness is about mercy and compassion for the weak, for the ignored, and for the exhausted. And Matthew is laying out this story for us in a way that's sometimes maybe a little too subtle for us a couple of thousand years later, but he's telling us a story that's rooted in the deepest truths that he knows about Jesus. That these broken, hurting, and sort of downtrodden people make it into this story of Jesus. Why? Well, because the prophecies about Jesus always said it would be like this. Isaiah 42, looking forward to the Messiah, says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. This story of people who have been sidelined or would normally be ignored or have been abused or have been treated badly, they make this highlight reel because this Messiah is going to be different. This Savior isn't going to work the way that everybody else thinks he's going to work. A bruised reed is almost impossible to not break. A smoldering wick, like how do you stop that from going out? But that's the gentle hand and the mercy and the compassion of this Messiah. Whenever I read this text, I always kind of find myself thinking it's worth pausing for a moment, taking a deep breath at a text like that, and sometimes saying, is this me? Like, am I the bruised reed? Or am I the smoldering wick? Or is someone you know that person right now? The story of Christmas is about a God who cares for that, who cares for people that wouldn't fit our standards and wouldn't fit the way that the world says we should be. It cares for the broken, the downtrodden, and those in need of mercy. In his fantastic book, Just Mercy, Bryan Stevenson says this: the power of mercy is that it belongs to the undeserving. So Matthew's story begins with a recalibration of righteousness. Righteousness is not going to be found in the kind of highlights reel of the strong and the mighty. Righteousness isn't found in the Instagram glossiness of everything being perfect. Actually, what Matthew's telling us by including this story, both of the people who were hurt and broken and sometimes the people who did the hurting and the breaking, Matthew puts them all in together because he's trying to tell us that righteousness isn't going to work that way anymore. It's going to work through mercy. Instead of a standard that you need to maintain and a place that you need to get to, what you end up with instead is a God who roots into something different. A welcome that comes not through what you've achieved or how you present yourself, but just based on who this God is. And this is what the Christmas story wants to tell us righteousness is. I mean, think about it for a moment. If Joseph doesn't get this, right? If Joseph says, no, I have to live by the law. I have to live by the standards. I have to create the image that everybody wants. Mary leaves. Maybe Mary then is found by somebody else and stoned to death. Maybe Mary is exiled. Maybe Mary dies. So the whole Christmas story, the whole Jesus story, the whole fact that we're in this room today celebrating this Christmas story again, all now hinges on, does Joseph have the ability to move beyond just appearing right in front of everyone else, to move into God's righteousness, which involves mercy and compassion and doing what's actually right. And Joseph was willing to step beyond what he believed and what he thought was normal into something different. The result is we have a Christmas story. We tell this tale that begins once upon a time in Bethlehem. See, whether it's the Old Testament law, as Joseph had to wrestle with, or whether it's Instagram, we always end up with standards that push us too far, that ask more of us than we can give. And when it asks more of us than we can give, we end up damaged and we end up disconnected and we end up in regret or with anxiety because we're trying to be something we're not. We're trying to present ourselves in a way that we're not. And yet Matthew begins his story with all of the dirty laundry aired for everyone to see because he's wanting to tell you righteousness doesn't require you to put on a face, to put on a mask and pretend like you've got it all together. Because this is a story of belonging. This is a story of contentment. A story that isn't attached to your performance or your appearance or your aspirations. This story comes by trusting the God who sent Jesus into that chaotic genealogy. By way of benediction, I want to read to you from St. Paul this morning in a letter he wrote to the Philippians. As I was reading this again just this week, I found myself thinking, I reckon Joseph could have written this text because it kind of speaks to the situation that he finds himself in and the decision that he has to make. Paul writes to the Philippians and he says, but whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What were the things that I used to gain? The things that I thought were worthwhile, the impressions that I used to give, the standards that I thought were the ones I had to keep. Paul says, what is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. See, because you might be King David with this horrible background story, or you might be Joseph staring at this kind of scandal that's on top of you, or you might be dealing with something in your own life where you're trying to present, this is how I want to appear. And the Christmas story says, you'll never ever get it quite right. Or you can sort of relax away from that and look at this chaotic story that Matthew begins with and remind yourself that where we really find belonging and contentment is when we start trusting in God. So my prayer for you this morning is that may you find this righteousness true in your own life too. And may God's grace and peace be with you.